Imagine finding a tiny wolf pup shivering alone in the snow, thousands of years before dogs even existed. Now imagine a human mother picking it up, tucking it inside her fur cloak, and carrying it home to her fire. This was not a rare accident that happened once in human history. It happened again and again, across continents and thousands of generations. Ancient humans did not just hunt animals, they also adopted them, nursed them, and raised them as members of the family. Mothers in hunter-gatherer societies have been documented breastfeeding baby monkeys, wild pigs, and even bear cubs alongside their own children. Entire tribes built daily routines around caring for orphaned animals that had nothing to do with food or hunting. By the end of this video, you will understand why this strange and tender habit may be the real reason dogs exist today. You will also discover what modern science says about a behavior anthropologists once dismissed as unimportant, or even irrational. And you will see why this ancient instinct might explain something deeply human about the way you love your own pets right now. This is the story of why our ancestors adopted babies from other species, and what it reveals about human nature itself. For most of the 20th century, anthropologists assumed that ancient humans only interacted with animals as prey or as threats. The common belief was simple: early humans hunted animals for meat, fought off predators, and had no time for sentiment toward wild creatures. But field researchers living among hunter-gatherer communities in the 20th century began noticing something that did not fit this picture at all. In the Amazon rainforest, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and across the Arctic, women were nursing baby animals at their own breasts. This was not an isolated custom found in one strange village. It appeared independently in cultures that had never had any contact with each other. Later in this video, I will explain exactly how this behavior may have led to the domestication of the very first dog. I will also explain what scientists now believe this tells us about empathy, and how deep that instinct actually runs in our species. And I will walk you through a real archaeological grave that changed how researchers understood the ancient bond between humans and animals forever. Let's start with the myth that most people still believe, which is that animal adoption is a modern, sentimental, Western habit. Many people assume that keeping animals purely for companionship, rather than for food or labor, only became common in wealthy modern societies. This assumption is almost completely wrong, according to decades of ethnographic research among hunter-gatherer and small-scale farming communities worldwide. Anthropologists studying tribes in the Amazon basin, such as groups living along tributaries of the Amazon River, found something remarkable in nearly every village. Households routinely kept orphaned baby animals, including monkeys, peccaries, cotis, and even birds, as full members of the family unit. Researchers estimate that in some Amazonian communities, the majority of households at any given time were raising at least one orphaned wild animal. These were not future meals being fattened up. Many of these animals lived their entire lives as cherished companions until natural death. Ethnographers recorded women nursing baby peccaries and monkeys directly from their own breasts, treating them the same way they treated human infants. This practice had a name in several indigenous languages, and it was treated as completely normal, not as something strange or shocking. So the myth that pet keeping is a modern luxury falls apart the moment you look closely at how ancient and tribal societies actually lived. What ancient humans actually did was build emotional relationships with animals long before agriculture, long before writing, and long before modern civilization existed. This single fact opens up a much bigger question, which is why would a hunter-gatherer, constantly worried about food and survival, bother raising a pet? There's something even stranger almost nobody talks about, which is that this same pattern shows up in the deep archaeological record too. In 1914, workers near Bonn, Germany, uncovered a grave dating back roughly 14,000 years, containing 2 human skeletons and one very special animal. Buried carefully between the 2 humans was the skeleton of a young dog, one of the oldest confirmed dog burials ever discovered. Analysis of the dog's teeth revealed something heartbreaking. The animal had suffered from a severe illness that would have made it unable to hunt or work. Despite being sick and completely useless for hunting or protection, this dog had clearly been cared for and kept alive for weeks, possibly months. Researchers examining the burial concluded that this animal was not valued for what it could do, but simply because it was loved. This is one of the earliest pieces of hard physical evidence that ancient humans formed emotional bonds with animals that had no practical purpose. Many scientists now believe that stories like this dog burial were not isolated events, but reflections of a much older and widespread human habit. That habit was the adoption of animal infants, especially wolf pups, long before anyone had the concept of a domesticated dog at all. Picture a small group of hunter-gatherers moving through a forest roughly 30,000 years ago, following the tracks of deer for food. They stumble across a wolf den where the mother has been killed, leaving several pups too young to survive alone in the wild. Instead of leaving the pups to starve, one member of the group picks up the smallest one and tucks it inside her clothing for warmth. Back at camp, the pup is fed scraps of meat, kept warm by the fire, and handled constantly by children who treat it like a toy. Over weeks, the wolf pup begins to recognize the humans as its own family, following them, sleeping beside them, and responding to their voices. This kind of scene, repeated countless times across tens of thousands of years, is now considered one of the leading explanations for dog domestication. Researchers call this the commensal or self-domestication pathway, but many now argue that direct human adoption of pups played a much bigger role. Genetic studies comparing wolves and dogs suggest the split between the two happened somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago. That timeline lines up almost perfectly with the period when modern humans were spreading rapidly across Europe and Asia, encountering wolf populations everywhere. If wolf pups were being regularly adopted and raised by human families, this alone could explain how wild wolves slowly became loyal, friendly dogs. Puppies that were naturally calmer, friendlier, and less fearful of humans would have had a survival advantage inside a human camp. Over many generations, this created a selective pressure favoring wolves with traits that we now recognize as classic dog behavior: loyalty, playfulness, and trust. But here's what most people don't realize: this pattern of adopting wild babies was not limited to wolves or to any single species. Ethnographic records from indigenous Australian communities describe the regular adoption and raising of dingo pups directly by human families. Dingo pups were carried, fed, and slept beside human children, and some researchers believe this relationship helped shape hunting cooperation between humans and dingoes. In parts of Papua New Guinea, communities have been documented raising orphaned cassowary chicks, despite the adult birds being large and potentially dangerous. Women in some Melanesian island cultures were recorded nursing piglets at their own breasts, treating them exactly like additional human children. This cross-cultural pattern is so consistent that anthropologists now consider animal adoption to be a nearly universal human behavior, not a rare exception. A survey of ethnographic records from dozens of hunter-gatherer societies around the world found evidence of pet keeping in the vast majority of them. This challenges the old assumption that our ancestors were purely practical, survival-focused people with no room for sentiment toward other species. It suggests instead that empathy toward vulnerable young animals may be a deep and ancient part of human psychology itself. So why would evolution favor this seemingly wasteful behavior, spending precious food and energy on an animal that offers no immediate benefit? This question brings us to one of the most interesting explanations offered by modern behavioral scientists studying the origins of human compassion. Many researchers believe that our instinct to care for helpless young is not species-specific, meaning it does not only activate for human babies. Human infants share certain universal traits that trigger caregiving instincts, including large eyes, round faces, soft features, and clumsy, uncoordinated movements. Scientists call this collection of traits the baby schema, a concept first described by researcher Konrad Lorenz in the middle of the 20th century. The baby schema was originally studied in human infants, but researchers later discovered that many young animals share these exact same features. Wolf pups, baby monkeys, piglets, and kittens all have proportionally large heads, big eyes, and soft rounded bodies compared to their adult forms. This means that a human brain wired to protect a crying baby may automatically respond the same way to a crying wolf pup or piglet. In other words, ancient humans may not have consciously chosen to adopt these animals. Their brains may have been biologically triggered to do so. This is a powerful idea because it suggests our love for pets today is not a modern invention, but an ancient evolutionary reflex. Imagine again that same hunter-gatherer camp from thousands of years ago, this time at night, with the fire casting shadows on the walls of a shelter. A child sits cross-legged, cradling an orphaned baby animal, while an elder tells a story about how the ancestors first tamed the wild spirits of the forest. In many indigenous oral traditions, animals are not seen as separate from human society, but as relatives, teachers, or spiritual guides worthy of care. Shamans and tribal elders in numerous cultures were often specifically associated with animal companions, believed to carry spiritual knowledge or supernatural protection. This spiritual framing may have reinforced and formalized a behavior that was already emotionally instinctive, turning animal adoption into a respected cultural tradition. Rites of passage in some cultures even involved young hunters proving their skill and character by successfully raising an animal from infancy to adulthood. This transformed a simple emotional impulse into a structured social practice, passed down deliberately from one generation to the next through oral tradition. There's another layer to this story that modern science only recently began to understand, and it involves practical survival benefits, not just emotion. Raising young animals gave ancient humans invaluable hands-on knowledge about animal behavior, movement patterns, diet, and warning signs of danger or illness. A tribe that raised wolf pups would learn exactly how wolves hunted, communicated, and organized themselves, knowledge that could improve their own group hunting strategies. Communities that kept orphaned prey animals, like young deer or wild pigs, gained detailed insight into their habits, useful for future tracking and hunting. In this way, animal adoption may have doubled as an early, informal form of biological and ecological education, passed through direct experience. Children who grew up around adopted animals likely developed sharper observational skills, patience, and an intuitive understanding of non-human behavior from a very young age. This kind of embodied ecological knowledge would have been extremely valuable in a world where survival depended entirely on understanding the natural environment. Modern researchers studying indigenous knowledge systems have found that communities with strong traditions of animal keeping often have remarkably detailed local ecological expertise. This suggests that what looks like a simple act of tenderness may have carried real evolutionary advantages for the entire community, not just individual comfort. But here's the retention twist most documentaries never mention. Adopting a wild animal was not always safe, gentle, or guaranteed to succeed. Ethnographers have also recorded cases where adopted animals grew aggressive with age, injured children, or had to be released back into the wild. Raising a young bear cub, for example, might feel manageable when the animal is small, but becomes genuinely dangerous once it reaches adult size and strength. Some cultures developed specific taboos or rules about which species were safe to adopt, and at what age an animal needed to be returned to the forest. This shows that ancient humans were not naive or careless. They carefully balanced emotional attachment with practical risk assessment built from generations of experience. Anthropologists studying these patterns describe a sophisticated, culturally transmitted knowledge system about which animals made safe companions, and which ones eventually became liabilities. This blend of compassion and caution reflects a level of ecological and social sophistication that early human societies are rarely given credit for today. Now let's return to the story of dogs, because their transformation offers the clearest evidence of where sustained animal adoption can eventually lead. Genetic research comparing modern dog breeds to ancient wolf populations shows a dramatic shrinking of the brain regions associated with fear and aggression. Domesticated dogs today have skulls, teeth, and brains noticeably different from wild wolves, changes that likely began accumulating soon after the earliest human adoptions. A famous long-term experiment in Russia, begun in the 1950s, tested this idea directly by selectively breeding wild foxes for calm, friendly behavior alone. Within just a few generations, these foxes began developing floppy ears, curly tails, and patchy fur, physical traits never intentionally selected for by researchers. This experiment demonstrated that selecting only for tameness and friendliness can trigger a whole cascade of physical changes across just a few generations. If ancient humans were repeatedly adopting the calmest, friendliest wolf pups over tens of thousands of years, a similar transformation would have naturally followed. This means the modern dog sleeping on your couch today may be the direct descendant of countless acts of ancient human tenderness toward orphaned pups. Every wagging tail and every excited greeting at the door may trace back to a behavior that began with a shivering pup rescued from the snow. This is not just a cute historical detail, it may be one of the most consequential emotional decisions our ancestors ever repeatedly made as a species. Let's talk about one more culture that offers a particularly striking example of this ancient bond: the indigenous peoples of the Siberian Arctic. Reindeer herding communities across Siberia have practiced close, intimate relationships with reindeer calves for thousands of years, long before formal domestication took hold. Orphaned or weak reindeer calves were often brought directly into family tents, kept warm, hand-fed, and cared for by children as personal companions. Over time, this direct emotional bond between children and young reindeer is believed to have helped ease the broader domestication of reindeer herds themselves. Researchers studying these communities today note that individual reindeer are still sometimes treated as named companions, not merely as livestock or economic resources. This blending of practical herding and personal affection mirrors the same pattern we see with ancient wolves, ancient dingoes, and ancient Amazonian pets. Across radically different environments, from freezing tundra to dense rainforest, the same human instinct appears again and again throughout the archaeological and ethnographic record. Humans are drawn to care for helpless young animals, and this instinct has repeatedly shaped the relationship between our species and the natural world. Modern psychologists studying empathy now argue that this cross-species caregiving instinct may be a foundational building block of human morality itself. If our ancestors could extend compassion beyond their own species to a wolf pup or an orphaned piglet, this suggests empathy is not narrowly tribal. Instead, empathy may be a broader, more flexible trait, one capable of expanding outward whenever a vulnerable creature triggers our ancient caregiving instincts. This idea reframes ancient humans in a completely different light, not as purely brutal survivalists, but as creatures capable of deep, wide-reaching tenderness. It also raises a reflective question worth sitting with, which is whether our modern relationship with pets is really so different from theirs at all. When you look at a dog curled up beside a fireplace today, you are looking at the living result of tens of thousands of years of adoption. When indigenous communities today still nurse orphaned animals by hand, they are continuing a tradition that likely stretches back to the very origins of our species. This is not a forgotten oddity of the past. It is a living thread connecting modern pet owners directly to their most distant ancestors. Let's bring everything together and look at what this ancient practice really teaches us about being human, both then and now. Ancient humans across completely unconnected cultures repeatedly adopted, nursed, and raised orphaned animals, not for food, but for genuine companionship and care. This behavior likely began as an automatic biological response to the same helpless-looking features that make human babies irresistible to protect and nurture. Over countless generations, this instinct transformed wild, dangerous wolves into loyal, gentle dogs, one of the most significant partnerships in human history. The same pattern appears in the Amazon, in Australia, in Papua New Guinea, and across the Siberian Arctic, showing this instinct is deeply universal. Far from being a modern luxury, keeping and loving animals as companions is one of the oldest, most consistent behaviors in the human story. This ancient habit also gave early humans practical ecological knowledge, spiritual meaning, and valuable lessons in patience, responsibility, and careful risk assessment. Most importantly, it reveals that compassion in humans was never limited strictly to our own species, even at the very dawn of our existence. The next time you watch someone rescue a stray kitten or bottle feed an orphaned puppy, remember that this instinct is tens of thousands of years old. You are not witnessing a modern sentimental trend, you are witnessing one of the oldest, most quietly beautiful behaviors that ancient humans passed down to us. If this story of ancient adoption and ancestral compassion made you see history a little differently today, consider subscribing for more videos like this one. This channel explores the forgotten wisdom of our ancestors, from prehistoric survival skills to ancient rituals that modern science is only now beginning to understand. If you enjoyed learning how a shivering wolf pup may have changed the course of human history forever, please give this video a like. And if you know someone who loves ancient history, human origins, or the story of our bond with animals, consider sharing this video with them. There are many more stories like this one waiting to be uncovered, each one a small window into how our ancestors truly lived, felt, and loved.